Hi everyone, I'm Emily Denton, and today I'm going to be presenting work that was presented at last year's main conference, titled Towards a Critical Race Methodology in Algorithmic Fairness. This is joint work with my colleagues Alex Hanna, Andrew Smart, and Jamila Smith-Loud. The previous speaker set the stage well for what I'm going to be speaking about today, by providing historical context for the US census categories that are so often leveraged in algorithmic fairness work. While racial categories are often treated as static categorical attributes to be leveraged in the loop of some algorithm, the reality is that racial categorization schemas abound and are differently defined by nation states, shift across time, and have their historical roots in racial projects steeped in white supremacy. In addition to the excellent histories that were just provided in the last talk, I'll also direct you to our paper for a fuller account than I can give here of racial category construction by administrative and scientific bodies. In short, these histories highlight the social constructedness of race, as Ian Hacking has said, the act of making people up. Of particular importance is that these projects of racial classification, like all projects of social classification, are political projects. They are simultaneously an interpretation, representation, or explanation of racial identities and meanings, and an effort to organize and distribute resources along particular racial lines. Yet, despite the highly political nature of racial categories and their decidedly socially constructed nature, algorithmic fairness methodologies often abstract away these critical social and historical contexts, and instead treat race as a fixed categorical variable. I've highlighted some group-based fairness definitions as an example, and these methods require clearly defined boundaries around different social groups. Of course, race is central to algorithmic fairness, given that race is a major axis around which the algorithmic allocation of resources and representation is bound. However, in our paper, we argue that failing to adequately account for the socially constructed nature of race, and by treating race as an attribute rather than a structural, institutional, and relational phenomenon, is conserved to minimize the structural aspects of algorithmic unfairness. The social centrality of race positions it as a critical concept in many other fields of study. And similar to algorithmic fairness, there's been a persistent and widespread concern in the social sciences and health fields with uncritically adopting racial categories as though they simply were referencing an attribute of an individual. I'm going to briefly summarize some of these findings from these nearby disciplines, but we'll point folks to our paper for a fuller discussion. To begin, scholars in other fields have identified patterns of inconsistent conceptualization and measurement of race across studies, which in turn poses challenges to the validity and utility of research results. For example, different measures of race can give rise to different health statistics, population statistics, and measures of social inequality. Widespread, uncritical adoption of racial categories, standardized or not, can also erode awareness of the social and political histories of racial taxonomies, and in turn reify racial categories as natural kinds. This reification can also re-entrench systems of racial stratification, in addition to leading to misplaced conclusions. For example, scholars within public health fields have noted that the use of race as a natural category can obfuscate the environmental, social, and structural factors that contribute to health disparities and lead to the racialization of certain diseases. There has also been widespread debate about the use of race as a variable in studies aiming at identifying causal effects, with researchers pointing out the social consequences of misconstructing race as a variable that can produce causal effects. Many of these objections point to the fundamental role race plays in structuring life experiences, making it simply nonsensical to talk about two individuals being identical save for race. When results of causal studies aren't appropriately contextualized, there can be a tendency to misattribute causal mechanisms of difference to the racial categories themselves, rather than, for example, processes of racism. In the context of algorithmic fairness, recently proposed causal fairness methods risk bumping into these issues when processes of racism are insufficiently centered and results are insufficiently contextualized in light of the complexities of racial categories. In many cases, race can't be done away with entirely, and so the aim is to denaturalize it without dematerializing it. The results of this look different for different fields, but include attempts in the public health field to shift practices towards the study of social determinants of health, and in particular, the multiple ways racism affects health outcomes. Other researchers have developed methods that integrate composite variables that model different aspects of race, in order to better account for its multidimensional, relational, and socially situated nature. And finally, while treating race as a causal variable can carry risks, appropriately contextualized descriptive studies have been identified as an important tool for identifying and understanding patterns of inequality. The problems with current uses of racial categories in algorithmic fairness won't be solved with a single methodological approach, but rather will take continual engagement with sociology of race and critical race methodologies. Drawing upon our lessons from other disciplines, we've outlined 4 provocations for algorithmic fairness researchers as a way forward. Our first provocation is a critical race challenge to group fairness. Group fairness criterion are predicated on clearly defined subgroups in the data set, with fairness being obtained by equalizing a particular statistic or set of statistics of the classifier across groups. Because these notions of fairness are predicated on abstracting racial categories into a mathematically comparable form, group-based fairness inherently denies the hierarchical nature and the social, economic, and political complexity of the social groups under consideration. These approaches can also obscure the unique oppressions that emerge at the intersection of multiple identities, instead treating oppressed social groups as interchangeable. Our second provocation is a call to center the processes of conceptualizing and operationalizing race, critically assessing the choice of categories and measurement schemas, and fully articulating and justifying these decisions in academic communications. We encourage researchers to adopt a multidimensional understanding of race, an understanding that demands that different dimensions are afforded different techniques of operationalization. More importantly, each of these dimensions affects different outcomes. So, observed race by phenotype has implications for computer vision models, while self-identification may be more appropriate for models understanding political mobilization. Our third provocation expands the frame beyond race classification and asks, why are we doing racial classification at all? We call to instead focus on the processes of racism. This follows the lead of other fields like public health in understanding not race as the determining factor for relevant health outcomes, but processes of racism and social stratification. Taking race seriously within algorithmic fairness would mean understanding how processes of racial stratification are implicated in the workings of socio-technical systems. We urge researchers to question the following. Is an algorithmic analysis delineated along racial lines critical to understanding patterns of fairness produced or reproduced by the system? In many cases, severe fairness concerns are evident prior to any quantitative race-based analysis of the system's outputs. For example, work recently examining the dirty data underlying predictive policing systems has highlighted how analyses can be centered not around race, but around racially disparate policing patterns. These kinds of research agendas echo much of the work from within health and biomedical sciences, which emphasizes a racism effect rather than a race effect. Lastly, we call for algorithmic fairness to center marginalized communities in the processes of research into the fairness of machine learning and the ethics of technology more broadly. This is also in line with critical race public health scholars who have called for researchers to involve community members in all aspects of research, to obtain necessary consent, and to share findings with community members. As an example, we've highlighted the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, who've performed participatory research with communities of color to understand ecologies of harm, data surveillance, and disenfranchisement built around predictive policing algorithms. They've mobilized around a prison abolitionist framework as a means of diagnosing, strategizing, and organizing against carceral technologies. We end with a quote that underlines this point of expanding the narrow frame of classification and understanding the concerns of affected groups. It reads, "It is not just that classification systems are inaccurate or biased. It is who has the power to classify, to determine the repercussions and policies associated thereof, and their relation to historical and accumulated injustice." In addition to critically assessing the choice of categories and the measurement schemas, racial classifications need to be interrogated from the perspective of who they serve. Thanks for listening, and a huge thanks to the organizers of this craft workshop for bringing us all together. I look forward to discussing some of these issues in greater depth during the Q&A.